Hello and welcome to episode 98 of Linux Dev Time. I'm Joe.
I'm Amalith.
I'm Kevin.
I'm Andy.
And I'm Allan Jude.
Good to talk to you all again, and welcome to the show, Allan.
Yes, thank you.
So you're not here as Late Night Linux family member and 2.5 Admins co-host today. You're here as Allan from Clara Systems.
Yes, you guys wanted to chat about some things. So.
Yeah, you recently wrote an article for InfoWorld, How to Upstream Code to Open Source Projects. And it got me thinking, what you do with Clara is run a business that contributes to open source. And so I thought that might be interesting to talk about.
Yeah, so the core of what Clara does is providing professional services around open source software. The majority of that is helping companies to make customizations and improvements to open source software and get them into upstream. Because that involves interfacing with the community and so on, which, individual companies probably aren't experts at, they can work with Clara and we can kind of be that bridge between the companies that are just trying to get their software and their product to work and the open source projects that are trying to do what's best for the project. And Clara acts as kind of the middle ground in there, providing the professional services and the support and the ongoing relationship that you don't really get if you're just hiring individual contractors or open source contributors to work on something. You're getting a long-term relationship with Clara, but at the same time, we're making sure that the companies are getting the best value out of it, but also that the open source projects are getting the sustainment and that long-term relationship as well.
Yeah, because almost everything you do gets upstreamed, right?
That's the majority of what we do. And what the article is about is kind of based on a talk I give at a open source vendor summit last fall. The idea of, what companies did traditionally was, we're based on an open source software. We're probably a little bit behind the bleeding edge of that software, in the last stable release or the long-term support version or whatever. And we need some extra feature customization for our product. So we're going to build that on what turns out to be this slightly out-of-date version. And then, maybe we'll try to upstream it. And when we do, it's like, oh, but all the code we base this on is changed out from underneath us in the meantime, right? Because we wrote this for the 2022 version and it's now 2024. And how can we solve some of those problems? And based on conversations I've had over the years and even talks I've seen at other conferences, like Facebook found that they had this problem when they were working on the Open IPMI project. So having open source firmware for the board management controller on their servers. And they found that if we had too many customizations, it just led to us never updating or getting stuck on an old version. So they made a rule that they always run what's in upstream. So if they want a new feature, they have to finish it and get it into upstream and wait for it to percolate through and come back to them.
Wow.
And they found that actually forced them to make better decisions about the thing, right? When you're building code to build a product, you're kind of like, get it to be good enough to do what we need it to do in this product, and it really doesn't matter if it's useful to anybody else. But that's always a problem when you upstream it, right? And one of the services Clara provides is doing the kind of generalization of taking that feature you built for your product and making it generally useful to other people so that the upstream project will accept it and not be like, well, this is just for your product and we're not just going to accept it and maintain it for you for free. But if it's something that's useful to everyone, then it will become part of the open source project and other people will use it and everybody communally will maintain it. And so what we found is that we can often convince the companies that are trying to build this, like for your long-term longevity of this code, we can design it from the beginning with the goal of upstreaming it. So we're going to design it to be general enough that it's useful to everyone and that we're not going to end up saying, well, this is good enough for what we need and we'll worry about it later, which often happens when you're building it for yourself and, with this kind of vague idea that we'll upstream it eventually. And it turns out to be a lot more work when you have to re-engineer it in order to be able to upstream it and then resync your version and all the other moving parts that happen there. So designing code from the beginning for the purpose of upstreaming it generally results in better code for the product that you're building and more maintainable code, right? You're not going to have to rebase it forward version over and over and over again, because if you get it into upstream early, then everybody else's changes are happening around it and with it instead of out from under you.
Have you ever had to deal with upstreams either not wanting to accept the code either as written or at all? Maybe even say with changes like, oh, we like the general idea, but we'd prefer to do it in this other way, which might be more or less what the company is wanting, but maybe not exactly, because I've experienced that before where upstreaming is difficult sometimes with the upstream.
Yeah, we've definitely seen that. Even a recent example with Samba. We did some changes for a storage appliance, added some integration with Samba for some new ZFS features. And we originally based it on existing support they had for ButterFS and did it that way. And they're like, well, this is common enough. Let's merge it together and do it this way. And then after we did that, they're like, we've come up with this new way in the meantime after thinking about this some, and we're going to do it this completely other way over here. And the biggest mitigation to that is engaging with the community early. So one of the things we can do when we're working with these companies is, while we're still in the design phase, before we've written all the code, start talking to people in the open source community and getting their input so that we design it the way they're going to accept from the beginning. But, that's anathema to some companies who want to keep everything secret and then just show up with a finished thing at the end and be like, here, you can have this now.
I imagine that can be difficult from the other point of view as well, of the open source projects you're dealing with presumably have a limited amount of time that they can spend on some random from the internet saying, I want to do this thing. Should I design it this way or that way? So do you have trouble getting feedback on stuff when you put it in that way?
It depends. With our focus being on FreeBSD and ZFS, we had both myself as a leader at the company, but also most of our developers are very big parts of that community. And so it's a lot easier, but also there's kind of a give and take there where we expect these people to come and review the code we submit, so we have to, at the same time, be reviewing their code. Mm-hmm. So, as we're helping them and giving our time to them, then we can earn back to get the same in return. And it's not so much as we show up saying, how should we design this, is more of, we're planning to do it this way. Do you have any input before we lock those decisions in?
Right. So really that's about being a good community member. And if people begin to see that you're contributing, then it becomes easier.
Yes. And the way the communities work is also different. Depends on the community. Like in FreeBSD, there are 200 people who have direct write access to the repository. So, if we have some code, technically we can just chuck it in and be done.
Right.
But there's a review mentality. We want to work with people and have this be long-term maintainable code. And importantly, we want to make sure that people are able to use these features. So one of the other things that we take extra steps to do is make sure there's not just documentation, but the kind of articles and news stories around the features we're adding so that people get interested in them and adopt them, because that's how we end up sharing the load of maintaining it. And it's not just that this code is in upstream, but we're the maintainers of it and we're the only people that use it. And so it's kind of a liability to open source if we ever go away. But if it's a feature that lots of different people are using and everybody's contributing to, that's how open source actually excels, and we get even new features that we didn't think of that somebody else has a need for, and kind of sharing that maintenance across many people.
Have you ever had to deal with CLAs or anything on any of the upstream projects? Because I had that happen on a previous employer. We had some code that we wanted to upstream. We wrote a bunch of stuff for upstream, but then it turned out upstream required a CLA. And the company I worked for at the time was very hard, no CLAs. However, I think if we'd had a company like this that was like, hey, we'll be the go-between, we'll sign the CLA or get it upstream, that would have been awesome. That would have been a best of both worlds, regardless of feelings on CLAs in general.
Yeah. We've had to do that. We contributed a bunch of code to OpenSSL to make it use its acceleration better on ARM on FreeBSD, to take advantage of FreeBSD's in-kernel crypto acceleration for the Nginx web server and a bunch of things like that. So occasionally we've had to deal with CLAs. And yeah, I think there's definitely a case there where it's like, we, the company, can't do this CLA, but we're willing to have you guys contribute some stuff on our behalf and deal with that.
Have y'all ended up ever becoming the upstream? I don't mean by forking. I mean as in the idea is a good one. However, the company that's paying you doesn't necessarily want to maintain it. They prefer there to be an upstream, not them. And there doesn't exist a good upstream, and where, Clara steps in and says, hey, we could do that. Or do you guys have any projects like that?
A little bit. We've done a few things, although oftentimes we can find a place in FreeBSD for that to live. But we do have a couple repos that we have of either our own tools or tools we've adopted that way, and trying to create communities around them. And yeah, as we're looking at more and more solutions to, especially one of the interesting things that happens inside companies is they have a no GPL v3 at all ever policy. And so that means needing an alternative to popular applications and libraries and so on. And BSD has many of those and has been working on, improving those or bringing those back when the GPL went from V2 to V3. And some of those, there is an upstream, but it's been inactive for 10 years. And so there's been cases where we've had to look at adopting that, or even now with the recent news around the XZ vulnerability, it's coming to the fact of like, maybe we can establish something where companies can pay a subscription to have us work as volunteer maintainers on their favorite piece of infrastructure that depends on actually having somebody looking after the store. And that might even be like as the real maintainer, but it's just someone who's contributing back to that and making sure it works. If you remember back to the Heartbleed stuff with OpenSSL, there was this big idea of having this core infrastructure initiative that was going to fund important open source projects and make sure that lack of maintainership didn't happen again. And that lasted a little while, and then it morphed into something else, and all the money goes to Node.js projects now. And not, OpenSSL and OpenSSH and all the things that actually run the internet. And so having something that's a little more targeted on specifically, if you've all seen the XKCD diagram with the whole thing that's held up by this one tiny library, and it's like, yeah, if you want to make sure that library doesn't go away on you, then that's an option.
Okay, this episode is sponsored by people who support us with PayPal and Patreon. Go to linuxdevtime.com/support for details of how you can support us too. Patreon supporters have the option to listen to episodes without ads like this. And it's not just this show. There's Late Night Linux for news, discoveries, audience input, and misanthropy, 2.5 admins about system administration, Linux Matters for upbeat, family-friendly adventures, Linux After Dark for silly challenges and philosophical debates, Hybrid Cloud Show for everything private and public cloud, and Ask the Hosts for off-topic questions from you. You can even get some episodes a bit early. We've got a lot going on, and it's only possible because of the people who support us. So if you like what we do and can afford it, it would be great if you could support us too at linuxdevtime.com/support. What strikes me about this whole thing is that it is a prime example of a business case for open source. Like, you're not doing the open source stuff just purely out of ideology and freedom and all that. You're doing it because it just makes more sense as a business for Clara and also the other businesses that you work with, right? It just makes more sense for everyone.
Yeah, like a lot of our customers are building some kind of appliance or service. And when they're doing so, it's a lot faster to start with a good open source base, whether that's, the FreeBSD OS or ZFS as the file system, when they're building, an object storage or a video editing platform or whatever it happens to be. But they need maybe more than what's included in the open source, right? They need to advance it. It's like, we need this to be faster for NVMe and lower latency, or we need this feature where we can rate limit individual containers so that one noisy container doesn't take up all the IOPS from the whole machine, and so on. And so building out those features and helping them get upstream so that they're not stuck maintaining it. One of the case studies we talked about at the talk that inspired the article in InfoWorld was, we had this customer where we built a feature for ZFS for them for ZFS 0.7. And we tried to convince them to upstream it. And they're like, yes, but not right now. We don't have the budget to do it right now. So then ZFS 0.8 came out. And they're like, all right, can you port this feature forward? Because we want the new features that are in 0.8. And so it's like, well, it turns out between 0.7 and 0.8, the way send receive works was completely redone to support this redacted send receive. So it's going to be a pretty big lift to port your custom feature forward. And they hummed and hawed, but they decided to do it, but decided again not to upstream it. And then when we did it again from 0.8 to 2.0, and again from 2.0 to 2.1, and finally they're like, okay, we get it. We will agree to upstream it this time, because otherwise we're just going to be stuck doing this feature over and over and over again on every new version.
And that would have saved them thousands of dollars,
Yes.
a lot of money if they'd just upstreamed it in the first place.
Yeah.
So it's probably better for you as a company then.
Yeah, but at the same time, it's not as interesting to just debug and forward report this feature a bunch of times rather than build a second new feature instead.
Yeah.
And, while we're in this as a company to advance open source, our team is still very interested in open source. And, they do this because they love these projects. And a big part of what Clara is doing is making sure these projects stay sustainable. if it's FreeBSD and ZFS and it's all volunteers, then they only have so much time and it's not going to drive the future. And the less interesting work maybe doesn't get done. There's a lot that could be done to improve the testing and so on. And that's not something somebody's necessarily going to do as a volunteer. And not that many companies maybe have a business use case to fund that. But by working together with a bunch of people who are using ZFS, and we can be like, we can have them each contribute some and make sure that we continue to drive the quality and the sustainability of the project, and that kind of maintenance stuff also gets done.
Are you telling me that you've solved the problem of funding open source software?
Not entirely, but we're definitely working towards, making these projects actually be sustainable. The model doesn't necessarily work for every project. Like XZ is in a kind of weird situation where it's probably not going to change that much, but does still need the maintenance. And maybe it is the solution to just have people that need it pay for a subscription to help maintain that project.
That's actually what I was going to ask you. Like, do people pay you just to essentially do maintenance without telling you, I want this new feature? Because that would be where I could see there'd be a gap where people are going to want you to do the exciting new thing and not just like keep things ticking along.
So in our bigger projects, we try to include some of that, especially even also the documentation and the testing, making sure that we don't really give them the option to have only the feature and not all the stuff around it that's going to be required to make it supportable, because FreeBSD is not going to accept a contribution that doesn't include some tests.
Yeah.
But the XZ thing really started us thinking of maybe we should just offer like, you pay a subscription and you get this many hours a month of, we'll have someone keep up on checking on the pull requests and the issues and making sure things compile and running the tests and so on these kind of semi-orphaned open source projects. Because we've come across them a bunch of times. It's like, this is really important software and it hasn't been touched in 8 years. And it works perfectly fine. But as the compilers improve and start having more and more warnings on by default, there's maybe things we can find and fix. And just, we want to make sure this software looks alive so that people will continue to choose to use it. And it doesn't end up with, we end up with monocultures like OpenSSH is a great project, but it's the only real SSH server. And it'd be really nice if we had 2 or 3 choices for every piece of software, just so we could have some diversity. And that's another thing we've been helping customers with. When they run important infrastructure that depends on stuff, Linux is a great solution, but maybe not 100% of everything should run Linux. If we set it up so that half of the servers are FreeBSD and half the servers are Linux, and then all across those, we use half this software and half that software as the daemon that provides the service, it means if there's a vulnerability in any one piece of software or any one operating system, kernel or whatever, or network stack, that we only lose half our infrastructure and the other half keeps up and we're resilient.
So it sounds like you've worked with some very large open source projects. Do you also work with smaller ones, and are there differences when you do?
Yeah. We're working with an open source project called RelayD, and the main person who wrote it isn't really involved anymore, and it's kind of in life support, and there's a couple maintainers, but it's hard to get their attention. And so with that one, it comes more to, instead of being able to ask for their advice, it's like, here's what we got, and we've had to work a little harder to demonstrate that this solves the problem that you have, and can we please get this merged? The hardest one really is the abandoned projects, where there's not someone you can talk to even, get maintainership or redirect the old GitHub repo to one that's actually active.
So what do you do? Just fork in that instance?
Effectively, and then try to find other people who, are stuck on the old version and would be interested, and try to build the new community around it again.
One thing you said earlier about bringing your contributions to these products and having not just the code or the feature, but also all of the things to make it sustainable. I think that's huge, especially when it comes to some of these smaller projects, because having been on the other side, like more the upstream side for a small project, when a company comes, I think I've mentioned it on previous episodes, but where a company comes in and says, hey, we have this new thing for you here, please take this. Sometimes as the hobby open source maintainer, that can be kind of stressful because this is a huge code dump that I have to go through, and it's a big maintenance burden. But had these companies come in and said, hey, here's the code, here's all the tests, here's all the stuff, and oh, by the way, we can also help maintain this going forward. Like, that would have been a huge thing for me as a nights and weekends person on an open source project, just being a small project myself. So
yeah, and so that, and maybe showing up before the finished feature to talk a little bit about it. So A, you know it was coming, and B, you could have a bit of input on it, and that maybe they get involved with the maintenance ahead of that to understand, we're going to have to build more tests for this. Your test suite isn't flexible enough. So let's work on actually improving that first as well.
Do you ever feed like series of patches gradually in order to kind of make it more consumable from that point of view?
Yeah. So recently we added an improved version of the dedupe feature in ZFS. And so that went as, I think, 7 or 8 separate pull requests, each of which is a whole bunch of commits so that it's much more reviewable because, you can't review 10,000 lines of code properly. So having a bunch of logical commits that this makes this change, this makes that change as grouped together as that is this feature is much better. And we find that it's a bit easier to get the review. And like we even had the first series of commits and pull requests for that was all no functional change. This just cleans up a bunch of stuff, fixes the documentation around it and all the nits we found before we could do it, and kind of moves some stuff to different files so that on the next pull request where we're actually making changes, there's not a bunch of the code just moving around that isn't actually a change, so that again, you can review, we just broke this file in 2, and this is what we actually changed.
And it makes it easier to audit as well, longer term, presumably.
Exactly.
It must be a difficult balance, getting your work done, but also not overloading the people who are reviewing or working with you. Yeah.
And a lot of that is basically contributing back the other way. Is like those people that are reviewing probably have stuff that needs to get reviewed too. And if we can help them with that, that works. And the fact that we're using a team on our side means that we've also reviewed it internally and externally before it's going into the pull request to try to ease that as well. But a big part of that is participating in the community. Like in ZFS, there's a monthly leadership meeting, and there'll be usually between 3 and 6 people from Clara on that call to talk about issues and brainstorm things and ensure that community keeps going and that we're contributing back as much as we're getting from the project.
There's this other open source maintainer called Filippo. I think his last name is pronounced Valsorda, possibly. He's a professional maintainer. All he does is maintain open source software, but the way he does it is by consulting with companies, building that long-term client relationship with them, but then not only writing code that those companies need for whatever feature they're going to add to their software, he also stays on top of mailing lists and keeps their requirements and their use cases and everything in mind as he interacts with the community, and he advocates for that company while discussing stuff with the rest of the community. If there's an upcoming change to a library, for example, that might make something they're working on more difficult, he'll step into that discussion and maybe try to nudge the feature implementation in a way that works better for his client, for example. And I'm wondering if Clara does anything like that.
Very much like that. The reason why we have so many people on the ZFS monthly calls and at the ZFS conference and at the FreeBSD developer and vendor summits is exactly that. To talk about the features we're doing, to get more people interested in them, to look for chances to collaborate with others who need similar features, and to advocate for our customers, some of which can come to those conferences themselves and some of them who might not be able to, especially all over the world and so on. So it's a lot of that. And it's very much like what that person does, except for we have a whole team here so that while one person's on vacation, you're not out of luck for a couple of weeks. Or, somebody gets sick, there's still people to take care of you.
But crucially, it's all in the open, right? So you are clearly lobbying effectively for changes and influencing things, but you're doing it in an open way. There's nothing like sinister about it.
Right. And, we're generally advocating for more than one point of view. And a lot of times that is literally, there's a use case that involves doing this. How can we make this feature work for everybody? Because in the end, it's advantageous to everyone in open source that features get used by as many people as possible, because that's that many more people who are lending hands to continue to maintain it and also just testing it and using it and being interested in it.
Well, I imagine there's also got to be some benefit where Clara kind of sits in between multiple clients of yours, where you can see common features or requests from multiple clients. And then you can say like, hey, this is a direction that would work best for everybody. Mm-hmm. And then you can get that upstreamed in a way that works for multiple companies, which I imagine if there's several, then there's probably several more that you haven't talked to. So that's a really awesome way to look at it.
Yeah. And, it can provide opportunities where, companies wouldn't be willing to work directly with each other, but would both work with us and get the result that everybody's happy with.
It's a really interesting model for funding open source because it's often there's these like crazy schemes of like micropayments and ways of like solving the general problem. And this is like sort of the opposite model, right? Of like someone needs something and it's to everyone's benefit to like they're already depending on this thing. And so that it's good for them if money goes to that thing, but also they need something done. And so they get it done. It just feels like a more less of a crazy idea and more of a just paying for things you need type model.
No, what we need is pennies worth of crypto being sent to people. That's definitely the solution, not paying a proper company.
Fractions of a cent.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's been absolutely great having you on, Allan.
Thank you.
I'll put some links in the show notes to the various stuff that we've talked about, but we'll be back in a couple of weeks. Until then, I've been Joe.
I've been Amalith.
I've been Kevin.
I've been Andy.
And I'm still Allan.
See you later.